everyone. Is there any more dubious an accolade for a musician than to be remembered as a one-hit wonder? Craig Sellar Lang, who died 50 years ago this year, is, alas, thus remembered as the composer of the Handelian pastiche tuba tune, a piece learned by generations of young organists, the beginning of which we just heard. I'm sure you can guess where this is going, and that I'm about to tell you that there is much more to C.S. Lang than the ubiquitous tuba tune. It's unfortunate that this, of all his works, would be the one to remain popular. It's certainly fun, but it's not a masterpiece. In spite of the impression that Lang's best-known composition might give, Lang was in fact a gifted composer and a notable music educator. Perhaps his greatest legacy is the music that reflects both of these pillars of his career, the large body of pedagogical works, some of which are still used by students today. I hope that today's talk will not only give you some insights into Lang's life and work, but might also generate some renewed interest in his music and his pedagogical works. Craig Sellar Lang was born on the 13th of May 1891 in Napier, New Zealand. He was the son of Alexander Craig Lang, who had emigrated from Scotland to New Zealand. His middle name, Sellar, was his paternal grandmother's family name. Young Craig was known as Robin, and that was the name he was called by his friends throughout his life. Robin's father died when he was a small child, and in March 1899, 7-year-old Robin and his sister left New Zealand for good, sailing to England on the RMS Gothic. When they arrived in England, Robin was cared for by his aunt and uncle, Nora and Andrew Lang. Andrew was a noted poet and scholar, and Nora was an author famous for her translations of fairy tales. Lang was educated at Clifton College, Bristol, and on leaving school in 1910, he enrolled as a pupil at the Royal College of Music, where he studied the organ with Walter Parrott and composition with Charles Villiers Stanford. Lang developed close relationships with both of his teachers. Stanford, who was notoriously temperamental, was not always kind to Lang, but Lang was devoted to his teacher. Stanford's friend, the Irish baritone Harry Plunkett Greene, recorded an amusing anecdote demonstrating the dynamic of the relationship between master and pupil. Lang one day brought to Stanford a new composition of which he was particularly proud, and was dismayed when Stanford merely glanced through it and laid it aside without any comment. Lang then accompanied Stanford on a walk through town, and as they passed an undertaker's shop, Stanford gestured towards the shop and said to Lang, "Take it in there." Lang's association with Walter Parrott, who was then Master of the King's Music, was his passport into the organ loft of Saint-Sulpice in Paris, when at the age of 19 he was invited there by none other than the legendary organist-composer Charles-Marie Widor. Andrew Lang died in 1912 and left his nephew £6,000, half of his considerable fortune. This legacy gave Lang the financial security that allowed him to devote his later life to composition and educational work, as we shall see. After completing his studies at the Royal College of Music, Lang took the degree of Bachelor of Music at Durham University, which he completed in 1920. After completing his BMus degree, Lang returned to his old school, Clifton College in Bristol, where he worked as assistant music master throughout the 1920s. This position involved only light duties, which allowed Lang freedom to focus on composition, and it was during his time teaching at Clifton College that he published his first choral works, about which we'll hear more shortly. In this period, he also had time to prepare for the examinations for the degree of Doctor of Music at Durham University, which he was awarded in 1925. In 1929, Lang left Clifton College to become Director of Music at Christ's Hospital, a public school in Horsham, West Sussex, where he worked for 16 years until his retirement from teaching in 1945. Through this position, he came in contact with hundreds of boys, several of whom went on to become notable musicians. One of the most successful of Lang's pupils at Christ's Hospital was Ivor Keyes, who at the age of 14 became one of the youngest ever Fellows of the Royal College of Organists. Keyes went on to be Professor of Music at Queen's University Belfast, Nottingham University and the University of Birmingham. Ivor Keyes' reminiscences of Lang are among the most valuable sources that have come down to us about Lang's life and work. Keyes described Lang's fastidious approach to teaching the rudiments of music and composition techniques, and the strong bias he had towards German music, which he had no doubt picked up from Sandford. Lang had little time for French music, Keyes says, or for the music of his European contemporaries such as Sibelius, or for that of the younger and more avant-garde generation of English composers represented by William Walton. Keyes reckoned that Lang's focus at Christ's Hospital was the music in the chapel. Early in Lang's tenure as Director of Music there, an enormous new 5-manual organ was installed in the school chapel by the firm Rushworth and Dreeper. The 5th manual on high wind pressure was designed to accompany the strong congregational singing in the chapel. The organ's signature noise was a tuba magna on 30 inches of wind pressure, which must have made an impressive effect in the chapel, and was occasionally used to play Lang's famous tuba tune. At Christ's Hospital, Lang arranged well-known orchestral works as organ duets to be played with his pupils at school chapel services. Ivor Keyes recalled that this was his introduction to a wide variety of repertoire, including movements from symphonies by Beethoven, excerpts from Wagner operas, and even Borodin's Prince Igor. Lang's efforts to involve the entire school population in singing for chapel services produced a number of works designed for both congregation and choir. These works were sung by the entire school, some 700 or 800 boys. The main tune was sung in unison by the congregation in a comfortable range, and the chapel choir interjected with rich harmony, frequently in 6 or 8 parts. Here is an example from one of these anthems, an arrangement of the 12th century German Easter hymn Christ ist erstanden, published early in Lang's tenure at Christ's Hospital. One can imagine the thrilling effect of this piece in the cavernous chapel of Christ's Hospital, accompanied by the enormous organ. Keyes described how Lang trained the entire school population to sing psalms to Anglican chant, and how he taught them his unison arrangements of well-known service settings by Sandford and others, so that they could join in with the choir. Lang was, as Keyes emphasized, no purist, and his infectious enthusiasm for music affected the entire school. The chapel singing at Christ's Hospital greatly impressed Ralph Vaughan Williams when he visited the school in 1938. Vaughan Williams subsequently composed a setting of the morning, evening and communion services in D minor for Christ's Hospital Chapel, which exploited the contrast between congregational unison singing and choral harmony found in Lang's schoolworks. After 16 very successful years at Christ's Hospital, Lang retired from school teaching in 1945, and from then on devoted his time to examining and composing. His formal teaching career had ended, but he continued his work as an educator by producing the pedagogical works for which he is chiefly remembered. After his retirement from Christ's Hospital, Lang's focus as a choral composer moved away from the repertoire he had composed for school use and towards part songs and music for church choirs. Lang produced quite a number of both sacred and secular choral works, although none of these are sung today. They are all attractive and well constructed. Some of them are rather challenging to sing, but rewarding, and certainly worth reviving. Today I'm going to speak about two of Lang's sacred works, and I'm very pleased to have fine recordings of these pieces made especially for this talk by the vocal ensemble Passio. Miserere Domine, composed by Lang in 1948, is a setting of a Victorian paraphrase of the medieval Latin prayer Anima Christi Sanctifica Me, better known today in Edward Caswell's translation, Soul of my Saviour, sanctify my breast. The paraphrase is macaronic, with a Latin refrain, Miserere Domine, framing verses in quaint English. This structure is similar to a number of the medieval texts used by Benjamin Britten in his Ceremony of Carols, which was written just a couple of years earlier. Lang, as we have heard already, had no time for modernism, and so took his inspiration from the music of the past. I suspect that this particular piece was inspired by the anthem Nolo Mortem Peccatoris by 16th century English composer Thomas Morley. Both use English texts framed with a Latin refrain, and both composers give the closing Latin phrase extended contrapuntal treatment. Lang concludes his setting with a fugal exposition, taking as a subject the alto melody heard in the opening two bars. Lang's music reflects the mixed heritage of this work's text, both medieval and Victorian, by combining elements of the texture and style of earlier English music with the harmonic palette of Victorian music. Some may consider this to be pastiche, but one can't deny that it is a well-crafted and very effective setting of this text. Let's listen now to Lang's setting of Miserere Domine as sung by the vocal ensemble Passio. Another interesting sacred choral work of Lang's is O Lord, Support Us, composed in 1950. Curiously, the score attributes the text to an anonymous 16th century source. Actually, the text is a well-known passage from a sermon preached by John Henry Newman in the 1840s. I suspect this misattribution was deliberate. Perhaps the publishers feared that having Newman's name on the title page might put Anglican choirs off the piece. The anthem begins with a nod to the allegedly 16th century origin of the text, with a madrigalian imitation of the opening phrase. The harmonic language, however, is distinctly romantic, with suspensions, retardations, appoggiaturas, and even a secondary diminished seventh, all within the first 8 bars. This marriage of elegiac text with a musical language that is both contrapuntally dense and harmonically rich puts one in mind of Parry's Songs of Farewell, a work that greatly inspired Lang's musical contemporaries. Lang was a prolific composer of organ music and wrote quite a number of pieces. Many of these, like the tuba tune we heard at the beginning, are short, accessible works written for young and amateur organists, a genre to which Lang contributed throughout his life. There are, however, a number of lesser-known, large-scale virtuosic works, most of which were written in the late 1940s and early 1950s, shortly after Lang retired from Christ's Hospital. The most substantial of these works is the organ sonata in D minor, published in 1947. This work is in 3 movements, and the influence of Joseph Gabriel Reinberger is strongly evident in its structure and textures. The first movement begins with a heavy, slow introduction, grave e maestoso, which leads into an allegro in sonata form, in which the first subject, which you can see on the bottom of the screen here, is a jaunty, scherzo-like refashioning of the motif from the slow introduction. The elegant second subject, first heard on the clarinet stop, is ingeniously recapitulated later in the movement as a maestoso tuba melody, as you can see here on the lower half of the screen. This is a thematic transformation of which Franz Liszt would have been proud. The second movement is a theme with 7 highly inventive variations which present a cornucopia of textures and musical styles. The final movement, Introduction and Fugue, begins with hints of the first movement's theme before launching into an extended fugue, the subject of which is derived from the opening grave theme, seen here on the top of the page. This theme is used to unify the entire piece. Pipeworks artistic director David Lee has made a fine recording of Lang's sonata on the organ of St. Patrick's Cathedral here in Dublin, and you will find a link to this recording in the description below this video. 2 of Lang's other virtuosic organ works were inspired by and dedicated to young organists that Lang knew and admired. His Introduction and Passacaglia in A minor, which, like the sonata, has strongly Rheinbergian overtones, was composed in 1952 and dedicated to David Wilcox. Wilcox, who was then in his early 30s, was organist of Worcester Cathedral, where he remained until 1957, when he was appointed Director of Music at King's College, Cambridge. Next to a work which evidently had a personal significance for Lang, the Fugue Trilogy on EGB. This work was written in 1952 for the young organist Ewart Garth Benson, a protege and close friend of Lang's. Benson was then organist of All Saints' Church, Margaret Street in London, famous for its high liturgical tradition and fine music. During Benson's time as organist at All Saints Margaret Street, he lived with Lang in his apartment in Artillery Mansions in central London. The Fugue Trilogy comprises 3 movements, each of which is a fugue on a subject beginning with a 3-note musical motto formed from Benson's initials EGB. The 3 fugues form a quasi-sonata structure. The first one is the most extensive. The second is a short and light-hearted divertissement. And the third is, in Lang's words, in the style of a toccata, with a skittish subject that puts one in mind of the toccata in D minor by Lang's mentor, Charles Villiers Sandford. The first of the 3 fugues is perhaps the most interesting and makes a fine standalone work. It opens with a wandering subject that hovers around the dominant 7th chord and never settles comfortably in the tonic key. This, along with the bubbling quaver motif of the counter subject, creates a rather playful effect. Here are the first 20 bars, comprising the initial exposition, as played by David Lee on the organ of St. Patrick's Cathedral. There is remarkable economy of material in this fugue, and Lang uses this initial subject to great effect modulating through the relative minor and introducing a stretto entry before the climactic entry of the subject in augmentation in the pedal in bar 66. Let's listen from bar 60 until the end. You'll hear the subject enter in the pedal in augmentation, followed by a homophonic statement of the subject, a brief cadenza for manuals first and then pedals alone, and a triumphant final statement of the subject. Although Lang left his career as a school teacher behind in 1945, school music and the support of young musicians were never far from his mind. He was editor of the 1949 edition of the Public School Hymn Book, which contained many of his original compositions and arrangements, and was strongly informed by his experience teaching at Clifton College and Christ's Hospital. Although Lang's original compositions are no longer in vogue, his pedagogical works have endured. Many generations of organists, me included, prepared for the Royal College of Organists diploma examinations by practicing Lang's fiendishly difficult exercises in score reading and transposition. Ivor Keyes asserted that Lang's pedagogical legacy was a significant factor in the maintenance of the high standards of the Royal College of Organists diplomas. These works demonstrate the breadth of Lang's gifts as a composer, attractive melodies, colourful harmonies, and ingenious textures, but also his resourceful and imaginative approach to solving pedagogical problems. The exercises are certainly frustrating, but never dull. A similarly clever approach can be found in one of Lang's more extensive pedagogical works, published in 1952 under the modest title A Miniature 48. This collection is intended as a set of preparatory studies to the 48, Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. Lang's preface makes the following apologia. The gap between the inventions and suites on the one hand and the 48 on the other is so wide technically and emotionally that the author has felt himself justified in an attempt to provide the student with these studies, particularly where the intricacies of fugue form are concerned. The pieces are cleverly constructed and encompass a variety of styles, making it an extremely useful pedagogical collection. Lang limits himself to a single page for each prelude and each fugue, thus allowing a student to practice different techniques and textures within a short piece. There is much attractive music in this set, and it is well worth the consideration of today's music teachers. Since Lang's death in 1971 at the age of 80, there has been little interest in his life or music. No biography has appeared, and aside from reprints of his keyboard exercises, copies of his music are not easily available, and his works are rarely performed and almost never recorded. A large collection of Lang's works, including many unpublished manuscript scores, languish in the library of the Royal College of Music in London. During Lang's lifetime, his compositions were frequently criticised as conservative. Posthumous assessments of his music, even by his friends and pupils, usually agree with this judgment. Lang was not the only composer of his generation to have this charge levelled against him. In a 1961 review of new organ music published by Lang, George Dyson, William Henry Harris and Herbert Sumption, the reviewer strongly criticised the conservative idiom of these compositions and wrote exasperatedly, quote, "Surely only organists could write music today, as if nothing had happened since Rheinberger." By 1961, Lang was an elder gentleman of the musical world, and he and his contemporaries, like Dyson, Harris and Sumption, continued to produce music in the carefully wrought but tuneful style that they had learned from Sandford at the Royal College of Music in the early part of the 20th century, because they knew that it would appeal to their audiences. To eschew conservatism and pastiche is part of the modern composer's credo. Consequently, there is today relatively little new music that is accessible to young musicians and amateurs compared with a century ago. Lang's output is full of enjoyable and well-written music, and there are even a few quite fine choral and organ works which deserve to be heard more often. In this year, as we approach the 50th anniversary of his death, we have an ideal opportunity to discover C.S. Lang's music anew.